So, welcome everyone to the Engagement Strategy Make It and Take It session. You are going to leave here with a plan and a buddy, and we are going to be here to help you along the way. And so, by way of quick introduction, we're going to jump right in and give you some background about engagement, different things you can be doing with it. Hopefully you'll get some new ideas and some strategies. So my name is Jennifer Brandel. I run a company called Harken, and we help newsrooms listen to the public before they publish, and happy to be here.
Audio producer at BuzzFeed, and before that I was a social media editor at the Washington Post.
I'm Ashley Alvarado. I'm the manager of public engagement at KPCC, and I'm board president of Journalism That Matters.
Hi, I'm Julia Hasslinger. I'm also at Harken with Jen. I'm an engagement consultant there. Cool. So as we get started today, we just wanted to have a definition of engagement that we're going to work from today. It doesn't need to be the definition that you use in your newsroom. I think every newsroom has its own definition of engagement. We're all still working this out.
Or seven,
yes. And so here today we're going to talk about engagement as a thing that happens when members of the public are responsive to newsrooms, and the newsrooms in turn are responsive to the public. So that's just like our baseline definition of engagement, but it's going to be different for every newsroom, just based on what your newsroom is trying to do in the world. So we have at Harken, we call this like our audience engagement ring. So you invite your public to do something, some kind of feedback, some kind of action. They take that action or they give you that feedback, and then you use that somehow, and you use that to create journalism that then in turn invites more public interaction, more public engagement. So we like to say if there's no pathway for input from your audience to actually shape the content decisions that you're making, then that's not really engagement. That's just sort of extracting something from your audience or asking them to consume something. But until you actually take what they give you and turn it into something to give back to them that will encourage even further engagement, that's sort of our engagement ring. So we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of examples of like what engagement made possible, so that you guys have the ability to dream really, really big in this session. As you're writing your plans, you can think really, really big, really, really aspirational in this space. This is a totally safe space to have wild dreams. But we're going to talk to you about things that engagement really did make possible in the world, and we think it's important to talk about the success you have with engagement in your newsroom, because if you don't tell people about those successes, they don't know about them. Your boss can't brag about you and get more money for you until they know that you're making a difference. You can't make the case that you should get more people or more budget until you show that this kind of work does produce the kind of benefits that your newsroom values. So that's why we're going to share our successes with you today, to tell you that it's okay to share your successes, and it's important to share your successes with your bosses. So.
Excellent. All right, and the first example, we actually have someone in the audience from this newsroom, Nashville. Mac, you want to raise your hand? Yay. So WPLN in Nashville, they have public radio, they did a fantastic story, and what they do is they have a series called Curious Nashville, where they collect questions from the public about anything they want to know about Nashville, and this woman, Denise, had a really great question. There was this park in town called Fred Douglass Park, and she was just like, so who is Fred Douglass? Because I have never heard of him, and he must be important if he has a park named after him. So he asked the newsroom started to look into it. Lo and behold, they couldn't find a Fred Douglass of note. So they ended up going to the archives, calling around, going to city council, trying to figure out who was this guy. Well, it turns out, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I have this wrong, it was actually supposed to be named for Frederick Douglass about 80 years earlier, and give or take. Yeah, the popular. Yeah, so it was supposed to be named after the abolitionist Frederick Douglass with 2 S's, and at the time there was something that kept the city from going full force and honoring this great abolitionist in town. So because there was something that kept them. Yeah, yes, we'll never know. And so because this woman asked this question and the newsroom got involved, the city council paid attention. If she would have gone just to city council on her own and said, hey, who's Fred Douglass? They probably would have been said, who are you and why should we care? We got other things to deal with. But because the newsroom was involved, they wanted to answer the question and be responsive. And it led to the park being totally renamed, having a ceremony here with a Frederick Douglass impersonator as well. And that was just one woman's curiosity turned into a new park, or a new rededication of a park for the African American community of Nashville. So that's one thing that engagement made possible, because Nashville created an inroad for the public to engage with them, and they listened back and they took action. So that's one example. Another one in Chicago at Curious City, which is a series I started a while back at WBEZ. People are always asking questions about Chicago and the region, and they think of WBEZ when they have questions because they're always responding to the public. And so a bunch of folks who were jogging and biking around the lakefront path, which is this beautiful path in Chicago, kept seeing the water fountains were on 24/7. They were like, this seems like a waste of water, why are they on? And so they asked Curious City, a reporter started looking into it. Lo and behold, there were lead levels way above the legal limit in park districts all over the city, and they were trying to flush the pipes because of this. And no one would have known, no news outlets were covering it, but because the observations of people on the ground, the newsroom took seriously, it became a national story and a story around Chicago as well. So those are just two things. A public health crisis was brought up by the public, and a park renamed.
Oh, so this is the project that I worked on for most of 2016 at the Washington Post, called Pay Up. It was a Slack community that I created with my partner, Julia Carpenter, and it was a community that we built on Slack for women in tech to talk about issues around the gender wage gap, and also like be resources for each other in their professional fights for equality. And so I just sort of wrote a quick list here that what Pay Up was doing was it solved a problem, it created structure, we reported out stories that seemed like consistent narrative threads in the community, and then we gave it back to the community. So when it's working in its ideal way, it's kind of this like model that, like a machine that feeds itself, or like what's that snake thing?
Oh, the Ouroboros?
Yeah, that thing. Yeah.
I don't know how to work a clicker. So I had a couple examples, and one is an oldie but a goodie, and it's a favorite of mine. It was these coloring books that we created when I was with California Watch. We had them in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, traditional, and simplified Chinese, and it was because we had a daily that was assigned, and our reporter discovered in what became a 19-month investigation that that schools were not prepared for earthquakes in California. They weren't up to code. And so when we thought about how do we do engagement, how do we make this story something people can dig into, we thought about who was going to be most affected, and the people who were going to be most affected were kids. So how do we get this information, this 19-month report, to kids in a way that's meaningful for them? And my bosses, for whatever reason, went along with me when I said, well, let's make a coloring book. And I would say that the thing about this too is that we were listening and we were enough to know we needed to do this, but then once we got it going, it was enough to also know, oh, we need to print 35,000 of these, and we need to do these different languages. And it continued to grow to the point where I was sending them overseas. And with what engagement made possible here, I couldn't find the Vietnamese copy that I had, but one woman came to me and she was just saying, this is the first time my mom has ever had this information in language. So that was one of the things that really stuck with me. Another project that I have much less claim on, but that is really cool, was Make Al Care at KPCC. And that was when we had a smaller election coming up, and one of our reporters who's he follows this stuff. He was surprised that there was an election, and if he didn't know, how was somebody who's not watching every bit of news come out know about it? And so we decided to go find an apathetic voter, and to try to make him care. And it just sort of ended up being fortunate that Al is LA backwards, and that he was a chef owner of a restaurant called Community. So we were really kind of laying it on thick with the potential meanings there. But that's what engagement did. We helped connect the dots for somebody and provide the information so that he could make a decision, and he chose to vote. So I guess I'm still on. One of the things, and I talked about this in a panel earlier today, that is really critical for me when I think about engagement is understanding the difference between audience and community. You know, you have an audience, you have the people that are already listening, and you might know what they want. But it's critical, not just for better journalism, but for sustainability, that we spend time listening to our community. And so in Southern California, it's a really big community. It's a very diverse community. And as we're listening to them, we need to also be prepared to pivot and to figure out how we're going to create journalism in the broadest sense that supports them. And so, yeah, I would just encourage all of you to think about when you're having conversations in your newsrooms, are you talking about serving your audience, or are you thinking about serving your community?
So if you have come in since we got started and you didn't grab a worksheet at the door, there are worksheets at the door. There are also worksheets up here if you're closer to the front. So we're about to sort of dive into the worksheet and get you going on your own ideas. So if you don't have a worksheet, get up and grab it around. If you don't have a pen, ask the person next to you. It's a room full of journalists. I'm sure there are enough pens in the room. So everybody getting settled? Cool. All right.
So as you're doing this and you're thinking about it, I would challenge you to think again. So the projects that you for your questions run through for that you were thinking of, who is it that you're trying to engage, and then what do you want to do for them, and or with them.
Oh yeah, so we're going to give you one example before you answer these questions for each of these different topic areas, just so that you can see what kind of thing we're thinking about when you're thinking about like who is your audience and where are they. So.
We did a project that we launched earlier this spring called Unheard LA, and what we decided we wanted to do was we wanted to go out into, again, our greater community and surface stories that are being told, but that we as journalists or we as a greater community just aren't hearing, that we're not listening to. And so we created all kinds of materials that we then distributed throughout the region to all of the branches of LA County Public Library, with a very, very simple but maybe hard to interpret question of, you know, what's your story? What's the story of you or your community? And that's how we did that.
So now we're going to give you guys a few minutes to sort of write down the answers to your questions for your project. Just sort of think about them. If you have questions, we're going to come down and like chit chat with you guys. If you have questions, throw your hand up. I'm going to see if we can get the music back on so we have some like nice music going. Cool.
All right, so we'll see you back in about 5 minutes. So just think about who you're engaging with, answering those questions. If you haven't filled out the first 4 already, that's a good place to start. So you have your launch pad there. If you need a pen, we'll come and give one to you. Just raise your hand. Do you need a pen? Okay.
What? Do you want to go see if they need it on microphone? They got it. Oh. Cool.
We'll just mill about and see if people are kind of, okay.
All right, we've seen some people moving ahead to the next section, so we're just going to give you a little bit of background on that one. So the next one is finding the people.
So before, when I was saying, who's most affected, it's always thinking about, okay, if you want to engage, the idea is you're engaging somebody, right? So if you're thinking about that, think about who is most affected. Think about where are they? And that could be a question of geography. It could be a question of platform. But if you're mindful of that, that'll help you get over sort of the first hurdle. And then who can be a fixer? And when I started doing engagement work, I really thought about the fact that if you go into a community with humility and with an understanding that just because you're there, or just because you're from a bigger news organization, that doesn't make you an authority. You can go in and you're telling somebody, hey, you're poor. Well, they knew they were poor. You can tell them your water's bad. They knew their water was bad. So who's going to be that person that can lend their sort of authority to you, so you have that coming in, and what do you do with it? And then I would, I have my own stuff, but I think we have to go to the next slide. Okay, so one example of going into a community with humility, and that, that idea that I don't know everything, was for Make Our Care. Megan McCarty, who is a reporter who led that project, she had to find an apathetic voter. And when we kept going back to our audience, well, we're a public radio station, we don't have that many apathetic voters, or we don't have that many people who will cop to being an apathetic voter who's listening to us. And so she literally went out on the street and made a sandwich board. It's fitting she ended up with a chef for the project, but that's going where people are and then being ready to do something with it. And so again, that's just the same sort of slide from earlier, but thinking about who's most affected, what I typically say is, choose the language, and again, that could be a matter of English, Spanish, Vietnamese, Chinese. It could also be formal or informal, but just connecting to people on that level, being on the platform, and that could be in person, online, social media, radio, and then the physical space. So if you're trying to engage somebody without ever leaving your building, you're going to have a much harder time.
So I work for a national news program, so our audience is all over the country. It's really hard to meet them in person when we're not physically there. So this is a great local strategy, but how would you nationalize something like that?
So I would think about things, I still think that you can get out of your building, and you can have partnerships with local organizations to help facilitate that. But there are so many resources right now. There's Hearken, Ground Source, there's the newly launched public engagement collaborative, Gather, that are full of either case studies or tools to help facilitate that process. And then there are also, it's a little tougher if you're talking about nonprofit versus for-profit, although I always have a hard time saying for-profit when I'm talking about media. But so nonprofit and not nonprofit. There are a lot of foundations and other nonprofit organizations that are trying to support that process.
Cool. All right, we're gonna put the music back on and give you guys a few minutes to sort of just think about who are the people you need to be reaching for this project, who is being affected by this project, how do you talk to them, and who can help connect you to them. So.
Yes. Okay. Got it.
All right. Everybody filled out that section. We're going to move on to the next one here. Turn the music down. Thank you. Great.
Okay, so assuming that you have figured out who your people are, what your question is, the next thing you're going to want to do, is kind of build a structure within your workflow to make sure it actually happens. So there's a couple of points to this. So one of them is like actually know what you're asking your audience. So it's good to be like, I'm curious about X topic and I want to talk to these people about this. But like know what you want from them down to like 2 sentences. Because if you can distill your ask down to that, it's a lot easier for the audience to answer it. If they don't know what you're asking, then they're not going to answer. So that's one thing. And that leads into kind of the like architecture that you build into it. So try to build out a structure within your team. Maybe that structure is just you, but like build in processes so that like when you're intaking the data or the engagement, you have a system to kind of flow that information. And I'll show you an example in a second. But so with Pay Up, it was really, really, really important to me that everything that we did in that community, all of those conversations were so sprawling, so we had to systematize it in some way so that we could analyze it, but also, track trends and keep track of everything that we were talking about. So these are some ugly screenshots, but it kind of gives you a sense. So in Pay Up, what we did a lot of programming within the Slack community. Have you guys used Slack? You guys know Slack? Yes. Okay. There's a lot going on in Slack, and it doesn't lend itself naturally to journalism and to like audience engagement in the sense that we tend to know it. So we built a whole internal architecture into the Slack. So, you know, once you're added, you are added to an introductions channel and a ground rules channel, and then there's a roundtables channel, and there's a Q&A channel. And the Q&A channel is where, like, on a weekly basis, we would have an expert come and talk about a given topic. And it was very structured. And every time we had a roundtable conversation or a Q&A with an expert, I created a folder. My partner, Julia, hated it because she's very much like a loosey-goosey, like flow with the wind person. And I'm like, spreadsheets. So there's a folder in every, like in our Google Doc or in our Google Drive. And you can see they're all numbered. So roundtable number 1, number 2. And then each folder would have a transcript, it would have a plan for questions, and it would have takeaways, sort of like a reflection journal. So here's an example from one of the transcripts, and I cut it off right before one of the members started talking to protect her privacy. But this was a conversation, a roundtable conversation we had about what women wear to work and why. So every piece of programming we have is documented like this. And that's really helpful because, next slide. Oh, sorry. Yes. The next step that we did was not only did we take that engagement that we had with our community that we built, but we took it and created hashtag content out of it to deliver back to the community, not only in the community like that we built, but also the broader sense of the community, women who work, women who care about their professional lives and also their personal lives. So when we keep meticulous records of the work we do, build out processes, it makes it a lot easier to create content that delivers like bottom line numbers that you can give back to your boss and be like, look, this work we did, it's not just touchy-feely good engagement, it's like good for business. Like we drove this many page views. So yes, these have been my thoughts about structure. I love structure. So yeah, now we have some questions here. And so these are just the questions basically that hit the points that I just talked about. So
yeah, we'll take the next 5 or so minutes for you to go through with your own project, trying to answer these questions. Wave your hand if you want to talk to any of us. You have access to some incredible engagement people here that can help you talk through any of the questions or quandaries you're having with your design of your project. So don't be shy. We're happy to come over and hear what you're doing and try and build on it. Okay, someone over there. Someone over there. All right.
Cool.
We got
We
some
got
people.
3
Start it
people.
up.
4,
We'll get some
5.
music
Oh,
on.
God.
Okay, cool. We'll find you.
Feels like an action.
yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to bring it back. Just want to make sure we have enough time to get to all the questions. So the next thing we're going to talk about is how do you make sure to give credit to the members of your audience who did participate with you and who helped you shape this content. So we're going to talk about how do you really highlight them, how do you thank them, and how do you keep them engaged after this project ends? What are you going to do with all of this engagement next? So.
Yes, so giving credit is very important. A lot of times people are doing engagement work these days and they're hearing kind of high-level trends. Everyone's talking about X or Y. And when you just start doing stories about X or Y, but you don't actually thank the people who gave you that information, it's a lost opportunity because they don't know that they're influencing the news. And if they did, they'd probably be pretty excited about it and they'd probably share it with more of their friends and family. So it's really important when you are taking something from the community, it goes from being extractive to a relationship when you give it back to them. And so they need to know that you did something with it, you appreciate it, and that they shaped what you did. So a few different ways we see people acknowledging their audience as at Harkin with the partners that we work with, is that they feature them in the story. So for instance, this woman here wanted to know about recycling, and she ended up becoming the protagonist of the piece. The whole thing was built around her questions, her experience in life, and so she was much more motivated to share this with her friends because it wasn't just 10 things to do with your recycling. It was a personal story for her that she was featured in. And then another thing is giving them credit at the end. So some of our partners will take a great question, answer it in a regular kind of traditional story, but at the very end, at the bottom of the piece, they'll put a little picture up in a profile of who is this person, why did they want to know about it, so that they could introduce their audience members to other people like them and show that they listen and that these are real people who are actually powering the stories that they do. And then a third thing, which is always fun, is actually sending people stuff. If they've contributed in some way and participated, you can thank them with, let's say, a t-shirt or a mug or a tote bag. This is like public radio land here. They love their tote bags. But you can send them some sort of appreciation, a thank you letter, a shout out on Twitter, whatever that may be, just letting them know that you heard them, that they made a difference, and that they are shaping your work, which they're much likely to have great feelings about you if you tell them that.
And then once you have them and you've thanked them and you've acknowledged them, they are primed to engage with you again. So make sure you just have something else set up, something else that you want them to participate in. It doesn't need to be related. It just needs to be something. So Ghost and Soda, which is a vertical of NPR, asked people what their questions were about women in the global world, just like any questions about women. And they did a story about microloans and whether microloans actually worked. And then at the bottom of that story, they said, You gave us such great questions. We're so eager to hear your questions. The next thing we're collecting questions about is global diseases. Like global diseases and microloans, not actually connected, but it's the same people who might be interested in both stories. And they're just telling you, we value your engagement and we're going to continue engaging with you, letting you know that we're still listening. So that's sort of one example of how you could continue to engage with people post-publication, even if that particular project is wrapping up. So now it's your turn.
Question.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, great. Okay. One-on-one time. All right. Raise your hand if you want any of us to come over and say hello, and we'll take about and help you with what you're working on. And we'll take about 5 minutes for this section.
I think let's combine these last two.
Yeah, totally. Okay. All right, we are just about done. We have a couple quick steps left. All right, everyone. I'm glad people are finding folks to bounce ideas off of. That was one of the hopes of this session here. So what we're going to do is we're going to end with you guys kind of plotting out your next steps and finding someone who's going to help keep you accountable to making sure it happens, because it's so easy with this work to go back to business as usual when you have a lot of business to take care of. So what we're going to have you do, you'll see on the sheet, there's going to be next steps about your deadline, what the benchmarks you have that you can kind of chunk out so you make sure you're keeping your progress happening. And what we'd like you to do is think about the timeline of your story, or the timeline of the project or initiative or series that you're working on. So please raise your hand if you're working on a story or a project or a series that's like less than a month in terms of how much time it's going to take to go start to finish. Like it's a short-term project. So raise your hand if you're doing a short-term engagement project, like less than a month of time to do the thing. Okay, raise them high. Raise them high. Higher, higher. Okay. Yeah, it's not ongoing. It's just like you're doing a one-off project that's like a short-term project. So who's doing a short-term project that's like a month or less? Oh, perfect. Okay, so you're going to be accountability buddies. Okay, good. And you work together? All right, great. You're already accountability buddies. All right, raise your hand if you're doing a project that's like a month to 6 months long. It's like a medium-term project. Okay. All right, raise your hands high. You're going to look around the room. The first person you lock eyes with whose hand is up is going to be your accountability buddy. Okay. So did you find an accountability buddy? Okay. And you can be a group of 3 if you want to. Okay. All right, everybody found one? Now for longer-term projects or series or ongoing things, please raise your hand if you're working on something that's pretty long-term. Okay, great. The first person you lock eyes with as you look around the room is going to be your buddy. I know it's stressful, but it's going to be, this is spiritual. You're going to find a friend. It's going to be great. Yes, very. This person is going to be in your life. They're going to be hanging out with your kids later. Okay.
Oh my God.
All right, and then anyone whose hand wasn't raised, who wants an accountability buddy, I don't know if you're doing something for longer than a year. Anyone not have a buddy? No? Okay. So you're already starting to meet each other, find each other, and you're going to exchange information so that you can be helpful to one another as you plot out your projects. Okay, it's already happening. Great.
Great.
Thank you, guys. Okay.
We lost them. Yes. So she and I are currently working on a project together.
What's up? Oh, she needs help. Okay.
So she and I are currently working on a project together. But she's been told to do stuff that hasn't been communicated to us.
Hey. Oh, hi.